Okay, and we're going live in about. There we go. Yep.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Melanie Simmons is here today to talk to us about plant management practices and how you can write good things in your Level 1 plants exam. If you want any questions, just write them in the chat and we will get them answered for you. So all the best, and I'll leave it to Mel to talk to you. Just write them in the chat.
Excellent, thanks, Mrs. Allen. I'm not sure whether it's coming up, but I can hear your.
Yep, gone now.
Okay, excellent. As long as you've got that, you don't need a delay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm just, without further ado, we're just going to share the screen and may as well get straight on with this presentation.
Now, at the same time, the second object is going to do work on the first object.
And the second object is going to... Okay, so starting with plants today. So we're looking at Level 1 Achievement Standard 90924, which is demonstrate knowledge of horticultural plant management and practices and related plant physiology. The related plant physiology is the parts of the plant and how they function in order to be manipulated, or how we manipulate those for our plant management practices. Just down onto the bottom left there, I've just got the achievement criteria of demonstrate knowledge, demonstrate in-depth knowledge, and demonstrate comprehensive knowledge. And one of the things that we're going to be looking at three main areas today that I'm going to focus on. Okay, so we're going to look at the various plant processes and the structures related to those processes. And then we're going to look at how and why the processes are manipulated. All of this is going to end up coming back to improved plant growth, greater yield, a better quality of product. I'd just like to break down the achievement standard criteria a little bit more. So demonstrate knowledge is your achieve area, and that's where you have to describe horticultural management practices, how they're done, and relate them to the plant physiology, so the parts of the plant, and or the growing conditions. So that would be temperature, light, humidity. Basically, when we talk about describe, we mean you have to state several things. Like a description is not just saying the car is red. The description is saying the car is red with 4 wheels and a sunroof and a tow bar and a steering wheel. So a description requires several things to describe, and you would need to include the structures that are affected, or if you're describing how a management practice is done, you need to include the equipment that is used, the tools as such. For merit, we're looking for a more in-depth knowledge, and this is where that linking comes in, that you need to explain why management practices are done, or why steps or particular actions within that practice are done. So you have to link those, the how it's done to the why it's done. That's where you're linking to the effect that it has, the effect that it has on the plant. And that gives, and to give reason as to why something is done the way it is. That you use, that for pruning, you would use sharp separations that are clean. The reason being that it will create a clean cut and be less likely to have a ragged site that infection and bacteria can attack, or water could get in, and a clean tool so that you wouldn't introduce bacteria. So that's that achieve merit linking. Excellence requires you to give a reasoned argument. So to come up with a good argument as to why you would select that management practice, or why that management practice is the best one to do. And your reason argument is usually done by comparing and contrasting. What is the same? What is different? What is the advantages? What are the disadvantages? And as I've said before, the best way is by discussing the advantages and disadvantages of the two. Try to give more advantages for your selected one or the best one, and just one disadvantage for the one that you have not selected, and vice versa for the second choice option. Give more disadvantages than advantages. That way you're building a really solid argument for the best management practice. These will also require you to sort of apply some knowledge about your plant processes and how that would be affected within that situation. What I also like to give my students is some words that help them with linking ideas or convincing their marker that this is a robust argument. We call them our merit and excellence words. So our merit words, you'll notice, they're linking. This is because this means that, and therefore, because of this, as a result, all words that you would start off with a description, and as a result of this, this is going to happen. This means that's going to happen. Our excellence words tend to be a little bit more as starters, like therefore that means, or however means you're going to give a comparison or say a negative about it. You could even use simple words like compared to or in comparison to or additionally. I just wanted to put those up there for you so that if you're having a bit of trouble thinking about how you can do that achieve merit to excellence step in your answers, then using these joining words can be really helpful. I'm going to start by looking at plant structure or plant physiology. When we're talking plants, we're talking about the ones that we eat, the ones that we look at, and even on a larger scale, as in orchards or like commercial gardens, potatoes and things. Let's start by looking at the roots. Essentially, they anchor them into the ground. It's involved for the absorption of water and dissolved minerals, and sometimes it does serve for food. What I want to point out here is that many roots have they have a main root or the tap root, and then they have secondary ones coming off them. So the primary root with secondary roots coming off them, and then within those secondary roots, you've got your root hairs. The root hairs are important because this is how water gets into plants in a process called osmosis. Now, for this particular standard, you are not required to have an in-depth knowledge of osmosis, but it is one of those processes that it's just good to know in the general, because it's how water gets into plants, it's how our dissolved minerals get into plants. It really influences plant growth, and the roots are something that we have to obviously look after when we're doing plant management practice. You could imagine that if you were just chopping away in the garden or using your push hoe too close to the plants, you would be cutting off some of these roots, which essentially means you're cutting off the plant's access to water and nutrients. You start to reduce the access to water and nutrients, and you start to reduce plant growth. So essentially, without going into too much detail, the soil out here, there's water in those pore spaces around. Because of transpiration, which we're going to talk about in a little while, water is constantly being drawn up the xylem. And that means that there's this negative pressure in here. So when there's soil in the water, there's always plenty of water outside, but not much in the root hairs. So as a drop goes in, it's quickly transported along here and up to other areas of the plant. And essentially, water going from there and into the root here is osmosis. Having a little look, these are what the root hairs look like. So this is just a freshly germinated seed, but we can see there those very fine filamentous root hairs where water would be taken up and dissolved nutrients. And you can also see that they are very easy to damage. They don't actually get any bigger than that. Root hairs are literally what they sound like. They're one or two cells thick, and they're just tiny little fibrous hairs. Moving on to the stem. Okay, basically this holds the plant upright. It helps to support the flowers and the leaves and the fruit. It has a vascular system throughout it, which can transport waters and sugars. Sometimes they can store nutrients, and it also is the area where new parts of the plant are grown in little spaces here called nodes. And I just wanted to point out that this is our stem with water and nutrients going up. We've got a node here with the leaf stalk. If we were to slice this in half and look down onto it, we would then see our vascular bundles in the stem with phloem and xylem in there, phloem and xylem up and down. I'm going to talk a little bit more about your phloem and your xylem shortly, but knowing that it's in the vascular bundle is very important. Looking once again at the pieces of our plant, as I said, we've got our nodes, we've got our internodes in here, which is essentially just the gap between, because you can't just have leaves coming out there. It doesn't work. The leaves need to be orientated around the plant to maximize light, and they tend to grow in a way that doesn't shade all of them. In the node here, we have a lateral bud, which basically means side. Lateral is side. And up the top of the plant, we have our apical bud. This is sometimes called a terminal bud as well. This apical bud here is the growing tip. This is what's going to make the plant grow taller. Excuse me. And these lateral buds tend to be the ones that will grow flowers, shoots, leaves, or new branches. A bit of information there on there. So looking once again at the vascular system underneath a microscope, and this actually is a microscope photo, we can see that over there on the left-hand side where we've got our stylized drawing, you can see our vascular bundles here with phloem and xylem. And when we look over here, we can see actually they are clumped into phloem and xylem with a cambium in between to separate the two. And if you think about it, you've actually seen these on leaves. Those leaf veins, they're actually our vascular bundles that run through the entire part of the plant. You can just see them in the roots. So phloem transports sugar. Phloem transports sugar. Sugar is a food, so an easy way to remember it is phloem transports food, as opposed to xylem, which transports water. Okay, another main part that we're going to need to know about is our leaf. Obviously, this is for the site of photosynthesis. And once again, we can see that they have those leaf veins running through them. Leaves are also the site of gas exchange. So these little gaps in the leaf are where carbon dioxide goes in, oxygen comes out, and water comes out. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water vapor, because they are all gases that come in and out of plants. You do need to know what each of these parts do, but essentially, the flat surface there, waxy cuticle, protects the plant, the leaf from losing too much water. And inside here is where photosynthesis occurs. This is where the products, the leaf vein, the xylem and phloem. So the xylem delivers water from the roots to the leaf, and the phloem takes away the photosynthesis products and distributes them around. The stoma or stomata is little holes in the leaf that allow the gases in and out. They're controlled by guard cells, and these guard cells can open and close stoma. So if there is plenty of, this is actually more information than you need to know, but they open when they're filled with water and they close when there's not much water. So if the plant is starting to dry out, then the stoma will close, which will help preserve water within it. The problem being is that the guard cells need to be open so that the stomata are open to allow in carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide is needed for photosynthesis. They also have to be open to let oxygen out, which is the byproduct of photosynthesis. However, when they are open, water can also exit due to transpiration. So plants tend to run this relatively fine balance between the stomata being open so that photosynthesis can occur, and also being able to close to reduce water loss. Moving on to the flower. I'm just going to briefly touch on the flower. Essentially, it has some the male parts to it and the female parts to it. Basically, the anther has pollen on it, which then moves, usually on a different plant, is transported through pollinators and lands on the stigma and fertilizes the eggs down in the ovary. But I just wanted to show you that we've got a female corn flower there and a male corn flower, which eventually becomes the corn fruit. Speaking of fruit, I wanted to also point out how these different parts, essentially the fruit is the ovary of the female part of the plant. So each one of those little corn is a seed. So ovary is designed for seed production, for reproduction. So flowers are all about reproduction. And if we have a look at our apple, we can see the different parts of them. So these little green sepals here are actually those little green sepals on the fruit. The seeds that are inside, well, these were the seeds, and they are surrounded by the ovary and accessory tissue. And this is the ovary here and the accessory tissue here. And that was the little stem that once held the flower up. Just as a out of interest, I thought I'd show, this is blackberries starting off with a very small node bud, like an undeveloped flower, a bud, and then as it just goes through its life cycle. So this is when it's being pollinated and by insects, and then the flower starts to die away and the ovary starts to grow and the fruit ripens, and on each of these is a little seed. It's that pretty stuff that you get when you eat strawberries and blackberries. The seeds are fertilized eggs and ova. Excuse me. Pass outside. So the seeds are fertilized eggs or the ova of a fruit. They're important because that's where we tend to grow our plants from, as opposed to cuttings, etc. So needing to know what seeds require is important as well. Essentially, here we have food storage, what is going to become the root and what is going to become the leaf. The size of the seed dictates how deep you're going to sow it. And one of our management practices, which is preparing a seed bed or cultivation to prepare a seed bed, it's worth pointing out that you're only going to sow your seeds 1.5 to 2 times deeper than its size. It's also worth pointing out that germination requires warmth, water, and oxygen. A lot of students write in their exam that germination requires sunlight, but it doesn't as such require light. It's usually the warmth from the sun that they require. Another thing that I'd like to point out, that emergence is the seedling popping up out of the soil or the growing media. So if we look at this image here, we can see that germination has occurred as soon as the root or radicle comes out of the seed. And then we can see that the seedling is starting to grow through, and by that 4th image, it has emerged, and it will unfurl and proceed to produce its own food via photosynthesis. Okay, all of those plant structures and that physiology of the plant is related to the functions that they have to carry out. And you already would have heard me talking about transpiration and photosynthesis. I'm going to look at a few of those in more detail. Basically, the plant is designed for photosynthesis, for its cellular respiration, which is the release of energy, and transpiration, which is the movement of water, essentially water, through and other dissolved minerals and saps that through the plant. Looking first at photosynthesis. Basically, this is a process that's carried out by all green plants. They're able to produce their own food. Mostly plants, most of it occurs in the leaves, but a small amount occurs in stems. Sorry. Essentially, it's the plant using carbon dioxide and water and the energy from the sunlight and a chemical or a pigment called chlorophyll, which is a catalyst or an activation agent in the plant, to produce glucose and water. And it will store, glucose and oxygen, my bad. It will store that glucose as starch if it is not used immediately. Photosynthesis can be affected or reduced by reducing any one of those products that it needs. So if you reduce carbon dioxide, photosynthesis will be reduced. If you reduce water, photosynthesis will be reduced. If you lower the light or reduce the light hours, photosynthesis will be reduced. It's also probably worth noting that nitrogen, which is a nutrient that we apply to soils, is quite crucial in the making of chlorophyll. So plants that are lacking nitrogen often aren't as green, or they start to yellow in colour. That's an indication that the soil is lacking nitrogen, and we should apply nitrogen to the soil. Nitrogen produces chlorophyll. Chlorophyll's green and is needed for photosynthesis. So a plant that's starting to go yellow will be doing very poor photosynthesis. It's also worth pointing out that this is a chemical reaction, so any colder temperatures mean that chemical reactions are colder and so are slower, so that photosynthesis would slow down. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but essentially plants use their products of photosynthesis for everything. They have made their food, and so they utilize their food, all of those nutrients. So for everything that a plant does, it requires the products of photosynthesis, including respiration. Now, respiration is how all living organisms convert the nutrients they have absorbed, be that eaten or grown or made themselves, or just absorbed through the membrane, like some bacteria and that do. It's how all living organisms convert those nutrients into energy, and that energy is used for growth and repair or general organism living, essentially. And it takes place in cells. Every single cell is respiring. Worth pointing out here that you will notice that it's the opposite formula of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is taking water and carbon dioxide and turning it into glucose and oxygen, whereas respiration is taking that glucose and using oxygen to turn it into energy, but the byproduct is water and carbon dioxide. Quite often, if you're asked in the exam you're only ever asked for a word equation for photosynthesis or respiration, students often get them confused around the other way, or so it's worth just noting that photosynthesis produces glucose and respiration uses glucose. You can affect respiration by affecting how much water is available and the temperature and also the different amounts of carbon dioxide and oxygen amounts and whether or not they're available. Just quickly to compare photosynthesis and respiration, as I was saying, essentially photosynthesis is using sunlight and carbon dioxide to make glucose and oxygen, okay? Whereas respiration is using oxygen to break up those that glucose and turn it into energy for growth and repair. And the byproduct of it is carbon dioxide. So we've got those word equations down the bottom there. Moving on to transpiration. Transpiration is essentially the flow of water through the plants from the roots and out to the leaves, okay? The fact that water is constantly leaving out the leaves and being used in the plant means that it is constantly being pulled from the roots, which means it is constantly being taken in through those root hairs. As we mentioned before, it enters through the root hairs. Nutrients are enter that way too. They are absorbed and dissolved. They're dissolved in the water. Water travels through the plant in the xylem, and we have an image here that shows you water going in up the stem. It gets used in these parts of the plant, but anything that's not used exits out the stomata. Transpiration also can be affected by water shortage. It can be affected by the wind as well, like a really windy days can evaporate off that water out of that stomata really quickly. So a management practice that we do is, and we'll look at later, is providing shelter, and that reduces that amount of evapotranspiration that goes on when you've got wind blowing over the leaves, or when you've got a lot of like high sunshine intensity or light intensity as well. You can reduce transpiration by increasing the humidity as well, which is just the amount of moisture that's in the air. So obviously, if it's quite, if the air's full of moisture, you're going to have a lot less of that evapotranspiration. And the thickness and the waxiness of the leaves. So without going into too much detail, you know, plants that have very thick and waxy leaves tend to come from hotter, drier and maybe windier climates. And so they have that waxy, thick waxy cuticle to help prevent water loss. Okay, looking at our management practices. For each of these management practices that we're going to touch on, you need to be able to link it back to those structures that we have covered. The vascular bundle of the xylem and phloem, the roots or root hairs, the fruit or the buds, the lateral bud or the apical or terminal bud. And you need to be linking that sort of stuff also back to transpiration, respiration, and photosynthesis as well. So you must know how each of these are done. I haven't actually gone into a huge amount of detail on how management practices are done. That is very easy for you to Google, to go and have a YouTube clip on how to go about, you know, applying fertilizer or how to go about pruning a rose bush. I've tried to focus more on the impact that that would have. Once again, Merritt is explaining why they're done, and then you're going to link why they're done to how it has improved plant growth or increased the yield or improved the yield's quality. Okay, so starting with providing shelter, obviously it gives protection from the elements. It reduces wind and it reduces wind damage. So if it's reducing the wind, it's reducing the water loss as well because it's reducing that evapotranspiration. You're going to, if it's reducing wind damage, then you're going to end up with less damaged plants and a much less damaged product. So you're going to have improved, if you were growing flowers, they're not going to get bruised or damaged petals. And if you're growing like fruit or kiwi fruit, then they're not going to rub against, apples or kiwi fruit, they're not going to rub against each other and end up with blemishes on them. Providing shelter also increases the temperature, and it helps to speed up plant processes. Once again, as we were talking about, chemical reactions are faster when it's warmer, and so those chemical reactions of photosynthesis and respiration will be faster, so you're going to end up with faster growth, which could lead to earlier harvest times, so your fruit or vegetables are going to be ready earlier, and warmer temperatures is also going to increase that rate of germination. It can increase your humidity, which reduces water loss through evaporation. It can protect against the elements as well, like severe elements such as rain or hail damage, or also even severe sunlight, intense light that can also be damaging to the plant. And often, so there's different scales, but if you have it in like a glass house or a shade house, you can automate it. So that means you can control that shelter or that environment even more. Essentially, the negative is that in providing shelter, if you increase humidity, then you are also going to increase the chance of disease being able to thrive and spread to other plants, particularly things like fungi that love sort of those warm, moist environments. And if using living shelters, such as shelter belts, like living trees, then they're going to require maintenance, but they can also be a host for pests. I'm thinking along the lines of shelter belts around, say, a blueberry farm. If you don't have those, if they are natural living trees, then they're just going to host a whole lot of birds who will eat all of your blueberries. So on a larger scale and living, we have those shelter belts in orchards and grapevines. Wrong way. On a commercial scale inside, we've got our glass houses, and you can see here that there's venting, there's water being supplied up here. You can pull these across to provide more shade or reduce the light intensity. This is a shade house, so not a glass house is fully enclosed and helps trap the light, whereas a shade house is what we tend to use for hardening off our plants. So getting them ready to be able to grow outside is what hardening off is. And you'll notice that it has more of an open side. There's a bit of automation and enclosing wall here, but essentially the sides can come up so that the plants are kind of half inside and half outside, preparing them for being able to be planted outside, because otherwise the shock from going from a glass house, where a fully controlled environment, to the outside, they could they could get windburn or sunburned or reduce growth. And this last one, these are called cloches. They're a more temporary structure as such. So you'll notice that one up here on the top left here, you can pull the sides up or down, and cloches are essentially for protecting plants from cold environment, meaning you could probably, this person here has got their tomatoes or lettuces in a lot earlier. That, there may be still a threat of frost, but a cloche will help prevent that cold temperature. Cultivation, basically that breaks up the soil and it helps with creating a good seed bed. Those of you who were at the soil webinar as well will thinking about how the cultivation can be done in small scale with our spades, forks and hand trowels and rakes and that, or on large scale or with minimum tillage, and that it helps with germination and emergence and sowing seed. One thing that we probably would focus more on in our plant and external as opposed to the soil one is the benefits of having a good seed bed, because obviously we're talking about sowing the seed, for really good plant growth, for that even germination and that even emergence. It's important for plants to be to have a level seed bed so that all of the seeds can be sown at the same depth. This means that they will all emerge from the soil at the same time, which means you're going to end up with even growth. And a level seed bed also means that water is not going to pool in in dips or hollows, or that some seeds aren't going to be planted deeper than others. We don't want our seeds planted too deep because they're stored energy. So that stored energy is what the seedling uses to grow that root and grow its shoots up to emerge from out of the soil. If it's planted too deep, that stored energy will be used up before the seedling emerges and unfurls its leaves and can start photosynthesizing and producing its own food. Right up until that point, that seed is what is providing the nutrients and the energy for the seedling. So large-scale cultivation with your plough turning it over and the harrows leveling it out and the rollers helping to press it down for that nice compacted, not too compacted, that firm compaction so that air and water is close by the seed so that it can, those are the necessary requirements for germination. And here's on a smaller scale in your garden, that rake there being for helping to level out that soil for the level seed bed. As you can see, both of these ones are for, on the larger scale, are creating a very fine level seed bed, and the rake helps with that on a smaller scale in your school garden or home garden. Very important, weed control. Okay, weeds are a problem in the garden. What I've tried to do with this slide, and I won't go into too much detail on it, but what I've tried to show that link between the achieve point and the merit point, that describe what that is and link that to the process. So even if we look at the first one, we can see that weeds grow fast, blocking light to the plant, because they tend to grow a bit faster. That's an achieve point. The merit point is saying that that blocked light reduces the plant's ability to photosynthesize. So linking that back to the process that the plant is carrying out, or the physiology. So one of the things, like the third one down, says that weeds can harbour pests that suck the sap from the plant. Okay, so that's the achieve. Reducing the amount of glucose. There's our physiology in there. That's actually a part that the plant has done, and it reduces its ability to be able to respire. So that's that plant process back again. Essentially, weeds can be removed by sprays like herbicides. Tools, you can use a push hoe, which is featured there, or you could do them by hand as well. And sometimes on a larger scale, they'll just sort of go through chopping them off at ground level. You can prevent them by putting down a weed mat or a mulch. Mulch is it can be like compost or bark or pea straw that covers that soil surface and prevents light getting down to where the weeds have emerged from the soil. So that can help prevent weeds growing. It could also, dense planting can do that as well, like making sure that your plants are quite closely packed together. And if you have a look at that image, we can see that our carrots are quite closely packed together, so there's not really many weeds growing up in there. Obviously, you don't want to plant them too close together because they'll crowd each other. And then there's also something called a pre-emergent, which is basically like a powder or pellets that you apply to the top of the soil. And as weeds come up and the seedlings touch them, that it kills them. Another management practice that we do is training. Okay, there are a lot of training methods. There's the spudding, stopping, thinning, staking, training along with exfoliar. There's pruning. There are a lot. I've just briefly pointed out 4 of them on here, mainly because they're the ones that people get. The spudding, stopping, and thinning are the ones that people get confused with. The spudding is removing those side buds. Remember those lateral buds that are going to grow flowers or fruits or leaves. And so you take those away, and it means that your plant is going to produce maybe less fruit, but better quality or larger fruit, because all of the energy goes towards those remaining buds. We do quite a bit of desbudding on roses and tomatoes. Stopping is also removing a bud, but it's removing that top bud, that terminal bud or the apical bud. Okay, so that's stopping it from growing taller and making it grow bushier. So desbudding and stopping, important to know the difference between those two. And then thinning is also the removal of plant material. So you're either removing fruit or blooms so that the remaining ones are larger and better quality, or you could be removing side branches to get a shape or to help train along an object and to improve the air movement, which is going to reduce fungal disease. Staking is exactly what it sounds like, helping provide the plant with a bit of extra support, particularly young plants. I'm thinking like when you're establishing an orchard or planting along the shelter belt and that, you want your plants to be upright, so you may need to put a stake in next to them, careful not to go through the roots, and next to them so that they will have that bit of extra support until their own stems become strong enough to support them. I just very quickly want to point out a couple of other training. So this is exfoliar training, and this you'll see that plant has actually been growing along wires, so this is done quite often in orchards. It means that it is very easy to get quite a lot of plants in there because you're just growing them narrowly along. It means that you can fit them into certain places. So like on a private property, perhaps just growing up along a brick wall. So you could have actually fruit trees growing along a brick wall and they don't take up too much space. It means that there's plenty of airflow in between. It's very easy access to carry out management practices such as pruning, spraying, or even harvest. And it actually looks quite nice. However, it does take quite a bit of time. So it's labor intensive, and you do need to know what you're doing. You can't just wind a branch or a stem around a wire. You do not want to break it. That's going to damage that vascular bundle, the xylem and the phloem, and going to prevent water and glucose traveling around the plant. Also, sometimes it can lower productivity. Not all plants like being trained to grow along something. We also tend to grow in up strings. So this here is some capsicum that are growing up strings in a glass house. Once again, harvesting is easier. They tend to grow taller. You've got better access for that management practice. You can easily get in to remove leaves and for pruning and that. But once again, it's very labor intensive. So there's 2 styles of training, indoors and outdoors. Moving on to pest and disease control. Okay, pests are a problem because they are damaging your plant. Pests and disease will damage your plant. So we've got a few types of different pests. If we're thinking like there's obviously the large scale ones such as your birds and rabbits. And then you've also got your chewing ones, caterpillars, slugs, snails. Snails particularly damaging on young courgette plants at the moment, if my garden is anything to go by. We also have some sucking ones, such as aphids. When you're looking at diseases, you can have fungi, such as powdery mildew or botrytis. Your bacteria is your fire blight and black spot virus. Once you get a virus in your plant, you're just best to remove the infected area and burn it. There's no real cure for viruses. You can do preventative sprays, etc. Clean tools, clean cuts, general hygiene and sort of washing tools in between jobs and plants will help reduce the likelihood of you getting viruses, of the plant getting viruses. So here I just wanted to point out there's some aphids, and you can see that plant's very infected with those. And here we've got, this is powdery mildew. So that's a fungi there. And this here is a bacteria. It's a black spot on some leaves there. Okay, there are there's actually 4 ways of dealing with pests and diseases. There is the physical control, which is physically removing the pest or disease. That's quite a lot of work, but it doesn't involve any chemicals, and it doesn't involve that much knowledge. You don't need that much knowledge. There's a chemical way, so you can spray herbicides or insecticides or fungicides. And there's also a biological control. So a biological control is often is another living organism that usually is a predator to the pest that you are trying to get rid of. So, for example, there's a wasp. Well, actually, for example, ladybirds like to eat aphids. So you can actually buy ladybirds, and if you release them into your garden or plants that encourage ladybirds, then they're going to come and eat a lot of your aphids. So biological control, physical control, and chemical control are 3 ways to control your pests and diseases. The 4th is a very clever mixture of all 3 of those, and this is called integrated pest control or integrated pest management. So you would have IPC or IPM. Basically, it takes the best of your physical, biological, and chemical. One of the main things to know about integrated pest control or pest management is that first you must know what pest you are dealing with. So this image up here, some of you may have seen them, is a pheromone trap. So it releases a pheromone or hormone that attracts generally the male of a pest species, because they tend to be around before the female, and it traps them on the sticky pad here. So this releases a chemical or a pheromone, and when they come in thinking that it's a female on heat, ready to mate, they get stuck on the sticky pad. And you can check on this every day, and by looking at what critters, males or insects or pests are stuck on that pad, you then know what plan of attack to do next. Is it time to release your biological control for those insects or for those pests? Is it time to do a selective chemical or insecticide spray? Is it time to actually just wander around and start picking those off, like caterpillars and things like that? Basically, it incorporates all the best of the biological, chemical, and physical. It's not without its issues, though. You have to know quite a lot. Growers need to be aware of what pests they are dealing with, and they need to understand the life cycle of those pests as well. And usually, especially if you're using a biological control, you still need a certain number of that pest around for that biological control to be able to eat or be able to lay its eggs, and depending on what type of control it is. Okay, there's a a few management practices that I didn't quite get to go into enough detail on. So I just wanted to touch on them really briefly on the second to last slide. So we're looking at nutrient application, which is basically applying fertilizer. The main fertilizers that we apply, obviously, is nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. When we're talking about, in this standard for plant management practices, fertilizer can be applied to the ground, or there is one called a foliar fertilizer. It's probably more level 2 for that one. But knowing what fertilizer is, how fertilizer is used in the plant is important for this particular standard, which is why I've just put down that it's for making proteins. And we went into quite a bit of detail before about how nitrogen helps make chlorophyll, which is why it's so essential if you're wanting your plants to photosynthesize. Pruning. Very easy to go and have a quick look on YouTube. There's like loads of videos out there about pruning roses or pruning apple trees, and it will tell you the steps of how to do it in a little video clip around there. I wanted to be able to let you know that pruning is important because it helps get a desired growth pattern. So obviously that tree that we saw that was expelliared, if it was just growing naturally by itself, or even expelliared like that, you still have to take little bits off it to get that desired shape. Likewise, if you're thinking about pruning roses and that, they grow very bushy and wild if left to their own devices. So being able to, prune them accurately gives that really nice shape, and it can encourage good growth for the following season. It also means that either the fruit or the size of your bloom being flower, it could be increased because, you've got less glucose and sugars and going to other areas of the plant. And finally, you will need to know about irrigation. Obviously, that supplies the plant with water. Water is needed for photosynthesis and transpiration, and for the opening and closing of the guard cells. There are loads of ways to apply water. Generally, in this standard, they tend to look at things like sprinklers or the drip lines that run along the ground, or overhead misting systems and things in glass houses or in controlled growing environments. Even if that's like just out in your school horticulture plot or anything, you may have sort of like an overhead irrigation system there. And finally, just to recap, you've got your main management practices there. Those are the ones that staking, thinning, disbudding, weed control, nutrient application, shelter, control of pests and management of pests and diseases, etc. And you'll see here that down on this one, I've also called it integrated pest management. And in the slide, it was called integrated pest control. They're the same thing. Those words are interchangeable. You are going to need to link that, any of those management practices, how they're done, you need to link them to the main plant processes, which is the photosynthesis, respiration, and transpiration. And you're going to need to link those main processes to what structures it occurs in. Where does photosynthesis? Where does respiration? Where does transpiration? So you're linking your management practices to the plant processes that occur in the specific parts of the plant, and relating all of that to light, the temperature, to the growing environment of the plant, the absence of weeds, the availability of nutrients and water. What is the temperature doing? So it seems like a really big one, but actually this little mind map should help you break that down into giving you an easy, logical follow through as you're answering your questions for those achieve merit and excellence. Okay, that's us.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Melanie. That was very informative. We don't actually have any questions today, so that's all good.
Yeah,
But I'm sure if anyone wants to ask questions, they can make contact with you.
yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. It was a great informative session.
No worries. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sam.